This morning, I'm Mike O'Hanlon with the Foreign Policy Program at Brookings. I have an amazingly privileged position to be able to coach this dream team, so to speak. And the way we're going to proceed, sort of like the original dream team from the 1980s, is we're going to let everybody be a superstar initially on their own terms and give you their one big idea about the part of the world they most study. And that's going to be round one. And then we're going to, and by the way, I'm also going to let everybody introduce themselves very briefly, even before round one, so that everyone's in the conversation quickly, right off from the starting gun. And we're going to move fast, because we've only got 1 hour and 10 minutes for this entire panel. And then we're going to look in a second round of discussion about the overarching theme of today, as Bonnie explained so eloquently, the linkages between foreign and domestic policy. We're not going to try to force every conversation into that framework initially, but we will look to see to what extent we can extract out some themes and threads after having heard the big idea that everyone's going to advance about their own part of the world that they study or most understand. And then we'll look to you to join the conversation for roughly the second half of the show. So again, we'll quickly move down the aisle with introductions, and then I'll come back and pose a brief question, which is going to be similar in character to each panelist, about their one big idea. Then we'll have some discussion and then bring you in. So I'm Mike O'Hanlon, and I work on national security here at Brookings.
My name is Janine Scott. I am the founder and the principal of America to Africa Consulting.
Hi, Emily Mandrela. I'm the executive director at the Center for Democracy in the Americas, where we promote dialogue between the U.S. and Latin America on issues where U.S. policy is at odds with the region.
Hi, I'm Laura Coupe, and I'm counsel on the House Committee on Homeland Security. I'm here speaking on behalf in my own capacity.
Hi, I'm Asha Castleberry, adjunct professor at George Washington University, teaching U.S. foreign policy in Congress, and also a board member of WCAPS. And I'm also putting my disclaimer out there that my voice only represents me and not the U.S. government.
I'm Jung Pak. I work on Korea issues at the Brookings Institution.
Hi everyone, I'm Sylvia Mishra. I'm a India-US fellow at New America, and also I lead the CBRN working group at WCAPS.
Thank you all. And so, Geneva, I can start with you. And I really just want to ask, a big idea that you would like to advance, either a concern you have about U.S. policy towards Africa, or some positive trends you see in Africa that you think people should be aware of, or some problems that we should all be aware of, irrespective of where U.S. politics are. In other words, the floor is yours to just sort of start us off with a big idea or proposal or a big concern, as you wish.
Well, I think if we look at U.S. policy towards Africa, in a sense, particularly now, I would say that it's a bit minimalist. We have had the administration put out an Africa strategy in December of last year with about 3 principal things around trade and commercial ties, terrorism, and aid efficiency. At the same time, I think we've also not really focused on some of the trends that we see on the African continent that could lead us to engage a bit differently. I look at some of the demographic trends and what that means for us in terms of long-term engagement with the continent, both for trade and investment, as well as for issues with the youth bulge, which also have issues that could be raised around terrorism and other threats that could arise. And I look at the fact that while we are looking at pushing against China and some of the others, that I don't think our particular engagement is as effective as it could be in terms of really engaging with, or really engaging countries in terms of some of the things that they're looking at doing. So when I look at the levels of U.S. engagement in terms of trade declining and the rest of the world rising, why is that so? Why are we having problems, or why are we not stepping up to the plate in terms of continuing the types of engagement that we may have had in the past?
Thanks. And just one quick follow-up, because you were so succinct, we have time for that. Africa, of course, is a fascinating and huge continent, 54 countries, more than 1 billion people. I think most population increase this century is expected to be in Africa, and some people think it could get as high as 3 to 4 billion by century's end. So there's both the challenge and the opportunity of doing so many things with those people. By the way, Laura and I both hail indirectly from the same small city in DRC. I was a Peace Corps volunteer there. Her parents are from there, Kikwit, and so we're certainly interested as well. But when you look at Africa and you take all of it together, you take these demographic trends, you know that there are more democracies than ever in Africa, but there are also plenty of strongmen leaders still left. There are hopeful signs of greater stability and rapprochement, let's say with Ethiopia and Eritrea, but there are also still plenty of conflicts in Sudan and CAR and elsewhere, much of the Maghreb. I realize this is an impossible question, but what's your gut tell you about, is this more a moment of peril or more a moment of promise for Africa?
I think for Africa that there is more of an element of promise. I think there is more light at the end of the tunnel than people may be willing to give credit for or that they're able to see. If you've engaged with the continent, as I have for over 30 years now, I think we see maturation of governments, as you say, in the democratic process. I think you see maturation of markets. I think you see the rise of a middle class. There are still elements that need to change in terms of strongmen that still are there, in terms of certain other types of D&G issues that we can point to. But I would say that the glass is much more half full than it is half empty at this point in time. The one element of concern that I probably would say is not getting as much attention as it could or should, has a little bit, is the rise of the terrorism rise, particularly across the Sahel with some bands in East and West Africa. And I think that, especially as we see changes with our Middle East policy, I think there's a linkage there in terms of the rise that we're seeing of some of those elements on the continent. They've been fairly well contained to date, but that's an element of a challenge or a problem that I see where we may need to pay a little bit more attention.
That's great, thank you. And Emily, now, same sort of question to you. What's a big idea that you would like to put on the table? And also, we know that Latin America writ large is a very complex region, and it has a lot of hopeful trends, well-established democracies in most cases, but also some pretty acute problems from Venezuela to elsewhere, concerns about crime levels, income disparity. So again, a very complex story, as you would expect from such a large group of nations. How do you sum up the opportunities at this juncture, and what's a big proposal or idea that you would want to advance to the crowd?
Great, thanks. I'll set up a bit of a competition. I would argue that Latin America is the U.S. foreign policy area that is most intertwined with U.S. domestic political considerations. And in Latin America circles, we call it intermestic, the mix between international and domestic, the linkages between and sometimes the conflation of international and domestic politics in Latin America. And the reasons are obvious: our geographical proximity, family ties, cultural ties, historical ties, the sheer volume of commerce that flows through the region, and Florida. And I say Florida because U.S. policy toward Latin America matters immensely to Florida. There's a large Hispanic population, a growing immigrant population in Florida from countries in Latin America. 2/3 of the recent arrivals from Venezuela to the United States have resettled in Florida. And just as U.S. foreign policy matters immensely to Florida, Florida matters immensely to presidential candidates. Its swing state status can't be overstated. And so this results in oftentimes an outsized role for Florida in the consideration of U.S. foreign policy toward Latin America, and oftentimes a decision-making role for Florida politicians. And it's an oversimplification to say that Florida is dominating all of U.S. policy toward Latin America. That's not quite as much the case with respect to Mexico, Central America, migration policy writ large. Just this week when President Trump announced his intent to cut off aid to the Central America and Northern Triangle, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras, Senator Rubio tweeted his disapproval, calling it counterproductive. But when it comes to Cuba and Venezuela, two foreign policy priorities for this administration, Florida is definitely in the driver's seat and has served as the backdrop for U.S. policy toward Latin America. Big speeches, big decisions. National Security Advisor Bolton was in Miami in November delivering a major foreign policy speech on Latin America. And it was billed as a foreign policy speech on Latin America writ large, but the three countries that were the focus of his speech were Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua, which he dubbed the Troika of Terror at that speech. And earlier this year, President Trump also traveled to Miami to deliver another major foreign policy speech on Venezuela. And Florida is serving as the backdrop for U.S. policy toward Latin America. And it's easy to see why diaspora communities would and should have a major role at the table when determining some of these decisions in U.S. policy toward the region. But there's a danger that comes when personalization drives policy rather than national security interests. And there are risks that come when emotions, strong emotions, and many of them incredibly justified, are dictating U.S. policy and, in some respects, military training, military planning toward the region.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Laura, if I could now move to you, my fellow Kikwit friend and Mbote. Never thought we'd get to use Kikongo on stage.
I know, right?
But I wondered, I realize you're not studying Africa or Latin America per se, but you're studying Homeland Security in the United States. And so, in a way, you can maybe speak to this theme of interlinkages as well as anybody. So please, floor is yours.
So in addition to the Homeland angle, I also bring a Europe and migration angle as well, because like Mike mentioned, my parents are originally from the Democratic Republic of Congo, and I was born in Germany and raised in Luxembourg during part of my childhood before we moved to Michigan. So I grew up in Europe and Luxembourg, and particularly when the EU was being celebrated and really getting its foundation for what it is today. And even the Schengen zone is named after the city of Schengen, which is in Luxembourg. So it is that background that I have. It is that background that has really helped me look at Europe in a very unique lens, especially as it has been developing now. And one big thing as it relates to Homeland Security issues, as well as issues related to Europe right now in terms of migration, there's a lot of discussion around how that migration is impacting national identities as well as security issues. But one thing that I realized, and Ursula provided a great foundation when it came to the discourse on migration or integration. One big issue in Europe is that they don't have the vocabulary to deal with this topic now, especially now, as Ursula had also mentioned, there has been a rise in far-right and populist parties. And one big example of the impact of those parties was a discussion around the UN Global Migration Compact, which was a non-binding agreement, but over time became very politicized. So when the compact was basically brought to the table to the UN in 2016 under the Obama administration, the world was all behind it because, again, we were in the aftermath of the migration crisis from the Middle East and Africa. But then with the election of the Trump administration, it was evident that opened the door for more far-right narratives to basically change the narrative on the importance of the compact. Because again, the compact was just really supposed to be a mechanism through which countries would talk about a strategy on how to deal with the forces of migration. And because of the discourse around the compact, in Belgium, for example, it led to the collapse of the Belgian government because the prime minister at the time decided to join the compact, but then it was in a coalition with a far-right party that decided to pull out of the coalition because Belgium had at that time decided to sign on to the compact. So really it shows that when there isn't that vocabulary and when there isn't engagement, especially from immigrant and migrant communities on the European side, that the leadership right now doesn't really have the tools or the messaging to talk to the populations that they serve. And I think the interesting thing around migration is that most migrants are housed in the developing world, so 85% of the world's refugees are in the developing world, and yet in Europe and in the U.S., it's created a great deal of political turmoil. And so one thing that I would like to raise as a topic that I think we both, on both sides of the Atlantic, have to figure out is how do we talk about migration, knowing that far-right and nationalist narratives are impacting the health of our democracies. And I think a big part of that is organizations like Arslan's or Mohammed's organization that really are bringing new voices to the table, because clearly these narratives are not only impacting our democracies, but also our national security. And I know a lot of folks this week were talking about NATO, but I wanted to talk about Europe and homeland issues in this context.
Fantastic. And one quick follow-up, too, given that you work on Capitol Hill, recognizing that you're speaking on behalf of yourself. Right. But nonetheless, I'm assuming that, I think I know the answer to this question, that the prospects for immigration reform this year or next are relatively low. But is there any potential movement or hopefulness, any way in which this incredibly hypercharged, politicized issue could see some degree of common ground, or is that just beyond the pale for the next 2 years in all likelihood?
Right. I mean, speaking of my own capacity, right now, I don't see any legislative solution, but I think I always have hope in our youth or millennials, because I think I have an immigrant background, and I think the Dreamers have created a great movement. So I think in those ways, those are ways that we can talk about immigration in a more humane and comprehensive way. So even if there's no legislative solution, I think there are other means through which we can push the narrative forward.
Thank you for sustaining the theme of hope that everybody's managed to. And Asha, maybe it's going to be a challenge for you, since you're from sort of, your experiences are in the Middle East, where the amount of hope is maybe dwindling by the decade. But there's still some signs of positive movement in some places. And also, you are an expert and you teach on U.S. Congress and foreign policy, and that's often where domestic and foreign policy considerations sort of meet head to head. So, floor to you for however you'd like to address these topics.
Yes. So, thank you so much. And I spent time as a military officer, work on security cooperation in the Counter Daesh campaign. So, I definitely my perspective built up as a result of being there for a couple of years. Yes, looking at the current strategy right now, as mentioned before by our keynote, that security still dominates the discussion when it comes to our MENA strategy. And how it relates to our our domestic policy, we clearly saw that play out yesterday, where we voted on to end the conflict in Yemen. And I still feel that as we continue our wars in our global wars in the Middle East, the American people are constantly feeling war fatigue, right? So Yemen, I think the Yemen conflict in terms of the vote yesterday is going to continue that momentum of let's try to end the other additional wars. But my idea is if we want to end these wars, we should do it with a comprehensive exit strategy developed by the AUMF. That's what I think should come to the table. We can't just end it and then just pull out. We have to come with some sort of comprehensive exit strategy, which is underscored by Colin Powell's doctrine. We must need an exit strategy when it comes to these global wars. Now, in terms of how the current strategy looks right now, I think it's a mixed approach. If you look at the continuity aspect of it, there is some continuity occurring. Started from Obama into the Trump administration. As far as countering Daesh, the strategy is pretty similar. When Trump came in, he continued on, liberating Mosul, going in all the way into Raqqa. Also, both administrations have invested a lot in terms of rebuilding these military armed forces in Iraq and in Afghanistan. And also, both administrations have condemned Bashar al-Assad for using chemical weapons. But there's also a division on whether, President Obama, he was more of, okay, Bashar al-Assad has to go, versus President Trump is more of, I don't really know what his stance is, right? So, but overall, in terms of the security infrastructure, both administrations use a very similar strategy. Also, if you look at populism, or how the liberal world order is being challenged in this strategy, is very interesting with this administration. If you look at the issue with human rights, this has been dismissed, just like what our keynote speaker has mentioned before, and we saw that play out with the Khashoggi situation, as well as looking at the Yemen conflict, where we saw the the executive branch pretty much supporting the funding of arms sales to Saudi Arabia that was contributing to the Yemen conflict. We also see where the liberal world order is being challenged in terms of regional unity. When the Qatari crisis broke out, we did see our former Secretary of State tried to become a mediator, but we also saw where the commander-in-chief sided with Riyadh over Doha. So that also was an indication where we're not really that serious about regional unity, and right now it's still at a stalemate between Saudi and Qatar. We also seen where our nuclear nonproliferation efforts have been challenged, right? So throwing away the Iran deal, as well as supposedly there's some speculation out there of supporting Riyadh to have its own nuclear weapons program. So our nuclear nonproliferation efforts in the region has been diminished. And then we also see these new initiatives that are pretty interesting, where in Afghanistan we're constantly we're in right now negotiations with the Taliban, which makes sense to a certain degree due to the fact that they have gained a lot of ground and the Afghan government has lost ground, and you have millions of people that are living under Taliban rule. So it makes sense to come to the table and speak with them. But I think another idea I'd like to put out in terms of looking in Afghanistan, especially with Pakistan, is that we do have a new leader there who is quite interesting, that I think that the United States could come to the table and talk to about bringing peace in that region itself. And also, the last point I want to mention in terms of men is that we are seeing more competition from Russia, especially when it comes to their foreign military sales program. They have been very successful as far as selling their some of their weapon systems, especially when you saw this play out with the S-400, where the Turkey was pretty much interested in purchasing the S-400 missile defense program. So the Russian foreign military sales program is definitely giving them a little more political influence, to the point where you're seeing that some states in the Middle East are becoming more comfortable with Bashar al-Assad actually staying in Syria. So we will see more to follow.
Fantastic. Thank you. Jung, the previous four speakers, each one has taken a whole continent or a whole region and given us a nice way to think about trends. You, by contrast, are more of a specialist in one country and one person. You were one of the CIA's top watchers of Kim Jong-un for many years. You wrote the #1 most popular Brookings essay of 2018 called The Education of Kim Jong-un, which is now being turned into a book, maybe someday a movie. And so I wonder what you would want to say about how we have opportunities or peril or promise on the Korean Peninsula today, please.
Thanks, Mike, and thanks to all of you for joining us at Brookings and WCAPS. I'm thrilled to be a part of this conversation. So I'm going to continue on with the pessimistic, side of the panel. So just to recap what has happened with North Korea in 2017. Kim Jong-un leader of North Korea, set about setting facts on the ground with President Trump. He tested intercontinental ballistic missiles that have the potential to hit the United States, and he had his sixth and most largest nuclear test. And given that, and in thinking about this panel about redefining national security, it occurred to me that when it comes to North Korea, it's good old-fashioned traditional ideas of national security, ballistic missiles, nuclear weapons, and the fact that we could potentially be under attack from a nuclear armed ballistic missile from North Korea. As an anecdote, I'll point back to, this was not so long ago, but in North Korea years, when you're covering the North Korea account, you think in the years and the weeks seem to be much longer, as if they're dog years. Not long ago, in January of 2018, there was a false ballistic missile alert that went out in Hawaii. Ballistic missile incoming, take shelter, you don't have very much time, go. And it was a false alarm, but the person who set the alarm or pushed out this text message didn't know it was a false alarm. He thought it was real. And it made sense why he would think it was real. At the time, this was when Kim Jong-un was calling the U.S. president an old, deranged man. President Trump was calling Kim Jong-un Rocket Man and calling him all sorts of nasty names and really threatening a military conflict that a lot of people thought, and I think it's true, that we were headed toward a military, possibly nuclear conflict with North Korea. And so people in Hawaii had reasons to believe that there was a ballistic missile attack coming in. And North Korea was at the forefront of people's minds, given the context in which the alarm was set. People rushed over to find their children. They tried to, they hid under bathtubs. They tried to find shelter. People cried, not knowing what to do. People got out of their cars and started running around on the roads, looking up at the sky, waiting for a ballistic missile to fall. So this is a very real, almost old school kind of national security coming to the fore and as a top story in 2018. But one of the things that and that was one takeaway from my experience looking at the WMD issue from the Asia perspective. So there was that conflict and how how North Korea seems to matter more. And Asia seemed to matter more. During the Fire and Fury days, I got lots of phone calls from friends from New York to the Midwest to LA wondering about whether they should go on their business trip to South Korea or to China or to Taiwan or to Japan. And it really highlighted how much our economies and and how the international had fused with the domestic. Third, what happened in Hawaii and these phone conversations that I've had with friends and colleagues who are asking me whether it was safe to go to the region really reminded me that America is a Pacific nation. I think when we're based in New York or Washington, it's and that we forget that that the United States is such a large piece of land, geographic land, and that Hawaii and the West Coast has been under a much bigger threat from North Korean and ballistic missile type activities than New York and Washington has. So I'd point out those three key points that. The old traditional forms of national security threats still exist. Second, that we are intertwined internationally and domestically, given Asia has the second, third, and 11th largest economies in the world. And third, that the geographic boundaries of the United States are large and that we are a Pacific country.
Thank you, John. Fantastic. And Sylvia, now moving to you to wrap up the first round of opening interventions. And you've got a big country and big region you study, India and the Indian subcontinent, but you also have specific interest in drone technology. So take it as you wish. Over to you.
Well, thank you, Mike and Bonnie. I'm very excited to join this panel. I study South Asia as a region, and I would cast my remarks on the subcontinent. So South Asia has been marginal to the U.S. global interest during the Cold War. But however, after the 90s, as and how South Asia's economic heft did grow, U.S. increasingly started paying more attention to the region. Also, the war in Afghanistan, and as Asha mentioned, the exit strategy from Afghanistan has become an important, also a sticking point in terms of how the Trump administration really shapes out its policy. But 2016 elections was viewed very closely in the region, where almost 1.8 billion people reside. And then there are several transnational issues and terrorism issues, and also it hosts two nuclear-armed adversaries, India and Pakistan. So what really happened in the United States had important policy ramifications and bearings for South Asia as a region. Whilst the world was entirely surprised by the sense of unilateralism that the Trump administration injected in its foreign policy and also domestic policies, the record of the Trump administration on South Asia has been has semblances of continuity with the Bush and the Obama administration. One of the United States' largest partner in the region, India, has been able to make gains with the United States on various policies that continued from the Bush and the Obama administrations. But essentially, also South Asia is the only region where the Trump administration had come out with two important policy pronouncements. One, which is the South Asia strategy in 2017 September, and the Free and Open Indo-Pacific, which essentially also looks at managing the rise of China. And in both the two strategies, India plays an important role and is pretty much at the heart of United States strategic calculus for the region. But I would like to spend some time reflecting also on the Afghanistan strategy. As Asha rightly pointed out, yes, it is important to talk to the Taliban. But however, the Trump administration has vacillated from 2017 till today in 2019. Initially, it did say that it would maintain a modest troop in Afghanistan, and then by the end of 2018, it essentially is trying to look at an exit strategy. However, it is important to keep in mind that these strategies do not involve the Afghan government. That is one, and which is extremely concerning. And second, the NATO countries have a commitment to be in Afghanistan till 2024. The United States negotiation led by the U.S. Special Envoy in Afghanistan is being headed unilaterally and without taking into concerns of the NATO allies, which I find extremely concerning and probably would be destabilizing in the long term in the region. In terms of Pakistan, the United States have been trying to follow a more transactional policy, especially under the Trump administration, where the administration has been nudging for all the right reasons for Pakistan to take more stringent and decisive actions on clamping down on terror networks. However, it is important to bear in mind that Pakistan plays an important role and also enables the United States government to formulate an exit strategy. So there would be still continuities in terms of how the US deals with Pakistan on that front. The positive picture that emerges from the entire South Asia strategy is the United States partnership with India, and both the countries have been bolstering bilateral ties in terms of maritime security, defense readiness, and also interoperability issues. However, there are still some sticking points, and as they say, India has also not escaped the Trump's treatment on trade issues, as the Trump administration tries to inject new uncertainties shaping new global trade rules. There are a lot of ambiguities on how the bilateral trade ties pan out, and also, and we can get into the weeds of it, the immigration policy and trying to clamp down on the H-1B visas has been an significant challenge in bilateral relations, which would probably create more stresses in bilateral relationship. But it is expected that the positive aspects would, and especially bolstering partnership in the strategic realm, would take more precedence, and managing these differences would be possible.
Fantastic. So we've got a lot on the table. We've heard about Sylvia's 1.8 billion people in South Asia. Jung Pak's 70+ million on the Korean Peninsula between the two Koreas. We've heard Asha talk about 500 million people in the broader Middle East. We've heard Laura talk about 500 million in Europe. We've heard also another 500 million in Latin America from Emily, and then the 1.1 billion in Africa from Janine. And we've heard some elements of continuity between Obama and Trump in certain policies, for example, against Daesh, or in engaging with India, a trend that had begun really, as you said, with Bill Clinton and George Bush. We've also heard about some sharp differences, not only in our panel, but in the previous discussion led by Bonnie, in which we've talked about immigration policy and the signature Trump administration focus on toughening treatment of the border, of allies, of certain groups, and certain potential concerns that he's got in regard to immigration. So what I'd like to do now is invite a bit of a conversation, a little more free-ranging. I'm not going to work down the road. Just want to invite people to speak in the vein of what Laura started to do when I asked her about the prospects for immigration reform. And she said, I'm not going to spend a lot of time handicapping what's going to happen on Capitol Hill this week or next week. But there's an underlying trend here in our country, which has to do with the next generation of leaders, which has to do with the demographics of our country. And that gets at this question that Bonnie and I wanted to build today's event around, of the longer-term interlinkages between domestic and foreign policy, not just what's happening in this Trump era, but more generally and more broadly looking long-term. So the question I want to pose to the panel, and just please feel free to start as you wish, is to how do you understand the dynamics in American society shaping our future foreign policy, looking not just over this next 1 to 2 years, but to the 2020 election and beyond. And I'm really trying to get away from specific individuals, not just Donald Trump, but Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, you name it. You can invoke any people you wish, of course, in your thoughts, but I'm really trying to think about forces in our country, trends in our demographics, in our domestic cohesion or lack thereof in our domestic policy, and how those affect our foreign policy opportunities, choices, what kind of constraints they impose on our foreign policy, and so on. And that's a pretty big question that can be taken in a lot of different directions. So I'm hoping that somebody is motivated to start the discussion. Again, building on the theme and the spirit of what Laura said, where she talked about long-term opportunities perhaps in how we think about immigration. But anybody else on their topic or on any other topic, would someone like to begin that part of the conversation? Laura, back to you.
No, definitely. I mean, as someone who's been an immigrant on both sides of the Atlantic, outside of my day job, I'm interested in the transatlantic space, and so it's interesting as a millennial and as a person of color when I go to think tank events around DC and folks talk about, well, the older folks in the room talk about 1989, not in a bad way, but they talk
about. That wasn't so long ago.
Right? So long ago, it's like I was born slightly before the wall fell, but it's interesting that they talk about, in German, the Mauerfall, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the Cold War, and also when I've watched a lot of the events around NATO and when it talks about 1949, and as someone who works in the transatlantic space and would like, more young folks and different constituency groups to be engaged in transatlantic discussions, it's interesting that, as our country becomes more diverse, talking about, 1949 or the Berlin Wall may not resonate with certain populations, and so I think it is important for especially folks who are going to be leading our nation in government or in think tanks to be more creative about how that's going to impact how we look at regions like Europe that have been traditional allies. And so in one way, I think America's demographics are an advantage because Europe is also changing. In Germany now, 1 in 4 Germans has a migrant background. And I think that's a very powerful statement because Germany initially was not considered or seen as a country of immigration. And the United States, in my opinion, has had a more successful record of integrating immigrants. And that's something that I feel like we could lead on. And then another thing, too, that I would say to the transatlanticists in the room is that since America's demographics are changing and we are seeing we have populations that have ties to Asia, to Latin America, and Africa, that we're not maybe going to be interested in Europe as much. Maybe, like June mentioned, America is also a Pacific nation. And we have a large African-American population and also a large African immigrant population. So the focus may be going elsewhere. So I think those demographic changes may lead to the United States looking elsewhere because America itself is changing.
I'm very proud we haven't had to mention the word Brexit yet in the whole conversation.
I know, I'm trying to change. I'm trying to bring a different angle because Brexit and NATO tend to dominate the discourse around the transatlantic relationship. But I think especially if we're moving forward, I think it's important to highlight these elements as well.
So others, please get ready to jump in too. But Emily, I wanted to actually ask you a question, and then please say whatever you were going to say as well. But you did a great job of making the argument that our ties with our hemisphere are as important as any other relationship we have with overseas nations, which is a pretty compelling argument. And you talked about Florida, you talked about Secretary Pompeo and the Trump administration's views. I also wanted to invite you to look out at the trends and see where the demographics are going in terms of this country and Hispanic and Latino populations and how that's going to affect domestic and foreign policy. But whatever else you wanted to say, please go for it.
I think, going to respond to that question precisely. I think I made the argument that U.S. policy toward Latin America is driven by a narrow subset of people in the United States. And I think going forward, that will necessarily change. Take Cuba, for example. They're very clear drivers of U.S. policy toward Cuba, but you see increasingly American farmers, for example, clamoring for access to a $2 billion market 90 miles off our shore. You see libertarians questioning why U.S. policy toward Cuba prohibits travel for tourism for tourism purposes in Cuba in a kind of get your hands off my travel kind of way. And I think the broader subset of the American populace and broader national security considerations will drive those policies going forward. Also in the realm of national security, the U.S. and Cuba have established strong law enforcement ties via dialogues, agreements, information sharing accords, and have seen success. In October of last year, U.S. law enforcement officials alerted Cubans to a U.S. fugitive from justice who would traverse Cuba en route to Russia. He had been on the lam for 12 years, and Cuban authorities were able to arrest him in cooperation with U.S. authorities and return him to the United States. Also in Central America, I think the conversation will increasingly be driven less by a conversation around fear of migration and immigrants arriving at our border, and more about investing in strong, stable partners in Central America, creating markets for U.S. goods, for example, that will, in effect, create the environment where individuals decide to stay in their country. They'll be more stable, they'll be more prosperous, more secure, better governed. And these are some of the areas where I think a broader conversation on the issue of national security involving businesses and various stakeholders will drive a more successful U.S. foreign policy toward the region.
That's great. Is it also fair to say, just in very broad terms, that Latino voters are a little bit more of a swing vote than certain other groups, and therefore both parties can be expected to compete for their votes and to recognize that this is going to be one of the determinants of future electoral victory or failure, and therefore the issues will naturally elevate and broaden?
Certainly, and I think that Latino voters are becoming more organized as well. But it's also important to state that many of them are not single-issue voters. They don't vote primarily on U.S. policy toward the region. They also care deeply about health care, for example. And so I think politicians will have to grapple with the challenge of determining what these large subsets of swing voters care most about when it comes to an election year.
Asha.
Yes, as far as looking at the changes. As being a professor at university, I get to really learn about how the younger folks feel about foreign policy, and I find it really amazing as an Army veteran that when I talk about counterterrorism or 9/11, they're like, I don't remember any of that, especially 9/11, right? Oh, I was like 2 or 3 years old, I wasn't even born yet, right? So when they view these wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, or Syria, they're very confused, or they feel more of, I don't even understand why we're there, we should just possibly leave. So I think that you're going to see where they're going to become more of just becoming like more detached from those type of issues and more of in favor of ending these wars. Also, while they're looking at these wars and really focusing on the funding aspect, economic security at home is becoming more of a reality. So they're saying to themselves, hey, why are we funding these wars that I don't really understand why we're in there? Meanwhile, I'm going through a lot in terms of economic challenges at home. So, there's going to be this debate between, okay, where our American dollars should go to that is more useful and evidently helping us in terms of economic challenges, or addressing our economic challenges in the 21st century is going to be more of a priority. And that's why these socialist rhetoric is somewhat more sexier to the younger folks, because they feel that it addresses a lot of their economic concerns.
Thank you. That's great.
With regard to the Africa region, as you rightly said, we're looking at a population of just over 1 billion right now, but the trends would indicate that by the end of the century, Africa will be home to the largest population of some close to 4 billion people, and I think that that carries both opportunities as well as challenges. I think you're looking at a very large labor force that, if well educated, can be deployed both on the continent as well as around the world. You're looking at market opportunities with the rise of middle class that would be emerging at the same time. And I think that that provides certain types of opportunities for everyone. But again, if the challenges on the continent in terms of addressing education, skills development, and other, if that's not addressed, then we will have the other side of the coin, which is, as I said earlier, will lead to unemployment issues, which could lead to terrorism issues and other types of instability. And so I think that we need to look at what are the types of peace dividends that we are in a position to sow in terms of working with leaders on the continent, and particularly youth and the next generations on the continent, to ensure that we are able to pull out the best scenarios for the continent and the implications that that has for U.S. in terms of investment opportunities, in terms of other types of engagements as well, and ensuring that we have peace and stability.
Do you think there's a way, if I could just stay with Africa for a minute, one thing that was striking, I think President Obama made probably a fairly astute political assessment that he didn't want to be seen as doing more on Africa simply because he was the first African-American president. And that was perhaps the correct decision for him, but it also perpetuated this fact that we tend to spend less time and attention on Africa than I think we should in general. And you mentioned that U.S. trade with Africa has been declining, and I think China's trade with Africa is now 4 or 5 times ours. Mm-hmm. And Senator Coons and some others have been working hard on legislation to try to change that, but obviously you don't legislate trade per se, and it's going to have to come to some extent out of the energy and opportunities of the private sector and American citizens. I'm not sure we should expect the African-American diaspora to be the major way in which that happens because, of course, African-Americans have often been here decades and centuries, and the links to the continent are perhaps not as strong as for some Latinos in the United States with their own countries of origin. I'm offering very broad generalizations that are not completely correct, I realize, but what's it going to take for the United States to really pay attention to Africa? Is there a key opportunity or a key new message that we need to find to try to incentivize, not just policy discussions at Brookings, but business leaders, investors, et cetera, to pay more attention to the huge continent with all the huge opportunities and big demographic trends?
Well, I think just what you said at the end there, that there are so many opportunities that the U.S. is probably not really leveraging as well as it could at this point of time. We do still represent the largest amount of foreign direct investment in the continent, but that's dwindling on a daily basis practically with the rise of others, not just China, but Russia, Turkey, and some others as well. So I think we really need to put a lot more emphasis on some of the commercial and economic development issues that we can work on, and that will provide us with many of the other opportunities. And that, in turn, leads to the jobs and to the stability and so forth that we're looking to achieve on the continent, perhaps. But I think we're not putting nearly as much emphasis on some of the private sector and commercial opportunities that we should have. And there's a question of education, I think, of the American business community and America writ large with regard to the continent and what it represents today as opposed to what people think it represents today or what it represented yesterday.
John, I'm tempted to, before going to Sylvia, I'm tempted to ask you a Tiger Mom question because we're both friends with Amy Chua, who was here last year and talked about political tribes in her new book. But the question I'm interested in getting at, you talked about the United States being a Pacific nation, and there are obviously important communities of Koreans, Japanese, Chinese, Indians, going towards Sylvia next, who are very important parts of our country and who whose energy, whose ideas we benefit from greatly. Do you see, I realize you're a Korea specialist, not a U.S. politics or U.S. demographic specialist, but do you see new opportunities from that community in terms of what they can interject into our conversation, into our thinking? We've had a big Asia-Pacific rebalance since President Obama's time. We are trying to recognize we're more of a Pacific nation. Laura has said that maybe we're going to be a little less Eurocentric in the future because of all these trends. Do you sense that the broader Asian American diaspora or community is going to inject some new ideas into our foreign policy as well, and in some ways affect our Asia policy, or is it more focused on being just part of this country, and we shouldn't look to Asian American communities for specific foreign policy interventions or ideas? You see what I'm driving at?
Yeah, I think that Asian Americans are a huge group that varies socioeconomically, educationally, as well as culturally, and I think the issue with Asian America is that they're the model minority without taking into account all of the various different experiences. And I think that the Asian American communities are getting much more as an observer, that more involved in getting into civic organizations and forming their organizations, business organizations or neighborhood associations, to try to inject a voice into U.S. politics. But my perspective is also, I found this conversation about Dr. Castleberry or Asha's comment about her students not having a memory, the African continent's youth, the burgeoning youth, and I also think about when we're talking about redefining national security, that we have to redefine national security because of these demographic changes, that we probably need to focus more on the African continent now than when it's too late. And I speak in terms of with the perspective of what's happening in Northeast Asia. I remember in 2014 or 2015, the sale of adult diapers in Japan surpassed that of baby diapers. In South Korea, the replacement birth rate is below 1. So there's a huge demographic time bomb about to go off in Japan and South Korea, one of the biggest industrialized economies, reliable democratic partners and allies in the region. China has excess men. And so while Asia is a strategic focus for the United States now, things are going to change. The respective countries' national security priorities are going to change. There are going to be demographic and other constraints on those governments, reliable allies and partners. And so I think what this panel is doing is really showing how we need to redirect and refocus and also anticipate some of those challenges in redefining national security, not just for what it means to us specifically, but also what's happening over there is going to affect our priorities in the decades forward.
And by just building on that point, by the way, just a couple of quick additional observations. One is that China may experience the same kind of downward demographics that we've seen already in Japan and Korea. China's lifted the one-child policy, but guess what? A lot of Chinese don't care, and they're not necessarily responding the way the government anticipated. I've seen some projections that China's population could dip below 1 billion by the end of the century, depending on trends and how they might be affected. And also we know that one of the strengths of the United States, we're lucky that we are a melting pot society, and we've got a nice, gently growing population, which is probably pretty good from the point of view of national power. So I think some of the debates about American decline and China's rise don't adequately incorporate some of these demographic trends, which may be more favorable to us than people often recognize. But Sylvia, I wanted to give you the last word in this round, and then we'll go to the audience. And you made a very important point, I thought earlier, that we've seen a lot of continuity in U.S.-India policy and U.S. relations with the subcontinent now for a number of administrations, and that's continuing. You know, you wouldn't think that there's a lot of similarity between Bill Clinton, George Bush, Barack Obama, and Donald Trump, except maybe on India policy. And is this a trend that you think we can now really assume is going to continue, or are there potential landmines out there, issues that could arise that could interrupt this otherwise fairly happy narrative that we're starting to see emerge?
Well, thank you. And before I answer that question, I wanted to underscore one point, and listening to all the panelists over here, one of the key ingredients for maintaining the United States global primacy has been its soft power value. Yeah. And the fact that due to all these talks about which are essentially inward-looking by this administration, what this is doing is essentially clamping down on the number of students that come to the United States to study, which is also an important factor of continuing America's soft power value. I recently read reports about how there has been a significant drop in the number of Chinese and Indian students in the United States, and these students also contribute to the American economy. Indian students make up almost 18% of the total number of students that comes to the United States every year to study, and Indian students contribute 7.5 billion annually. So that is one thing possibly going ahead one would need to grapple with. This is for the U.S. policymakers to think through how to sustain America's soft power. And in terms of discussing India-U.S. relations and the future of a bilateral partnership, while we often say in the strategic community of both the countries that we have agreed to disagree on several issues, there are several outstanding differences, and to a great extent, the Indian policymakers also feel that the United States have been very transactional, and which is fair, especially on economic policy issues. There are a gamut of issues on which both the countries are not looking eye to eye, and that's fine, but both the countries should see to it that there is no spillover in terms of the broader strategic continuities and essentially the commonalities of security interest in the broader Indo-Pacific. Now, the rise of China and essentially managing its rise is going to be a problem and a challenge not only for the United States but also for Japan, Australia, Vietnam, Indonesia, India, and several of the Indo-Pacific countries. And investing in robust partnership, especially the likes of Australia, Japan, India, and essentially the Quad, and how the United States is able to coordinate its resources and essentially inject a rules-based order in the region is going to be a key area of both concern and also opportunity. One area where which has come, and one issue that has come into sharper focus in the Trump administration is essentially nudging its allies and strategic partner to take a more share the burden. So the United States is trying to get its strategic partners and allies to do greater burden sharing in the Indo-Pacific and also in Europe, which necessarily is not a bad thing, but how all these countries should closely coordinate should be an area of concern and also a study for strategic analysts.
Fantastic. So now we'll go to you. I think I'm going to do one mega round of questions. We've got about 18 minutes, and we want to then go right into our second panel. So we'll take 5 or 6 questions or whatever number you have, and I'm going to ask the panelists to each be taking notes on the 1 or 2 questions you want to respond to. And that's all we're going to really have time for. So once we hear some questions, we'll have about 1 or 2 minutes per panelist for each person to address 1 or at most 2 questions. And we'll start here with the gentleman in the 5th row, and then we'll come over here to the woman across the way.
Hi, good morning, everybody. James Siebens from the Stimson Center. This question is about Africa and development. I I have some ground truth in the region, sub-Saharan Africa, and there is a good deal of resentment building up, actually, about the amount of Chinese investment in infrastructure projects. There's a sense that the populations are not necessarily seeing employment benefits or financial benefits from that as directly. And so this goes to foreign direct investment. How can the U.S. continue to invest in the region without generating the kind of sense that there's a sort of neo-colonial purpose behind it and there's benefits accruing to the investors and not the host countries?
Great, thank you. And then we'll come over here, please.
Thank you. Sofia Orlowski with Freedom House. I think this conversation is very important, and as someone who works on human rights and democracy issues around the world, I think that there is a fundamental vulnerability right now that the United States faces as we lost our leadership role in the international arena on democracy, being a democracy champion and promoting the respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms. As democracy declines around the world and in the United States, how prepared are the decision makers here, both at the federal level but also around the states and local jurisdictions, to identify the red flags that we are seeing all around the world and all the regions that you cover, that democracy is under attack? The attack on press freedom, judicial independence, the independence of prosecutorial inquiry, immigration issues, minority rights. All of these things have happened before, and we see them elsewhere, but how are we prepared to identify them here and sound the alarm early enough before it's too late?
And we'll come over here to these two questions. And I've been asked to ask you to stand when you pose your question, please, so we make sure we get your beautiful face on C-SPAN.
Thank you. David Webb, Defense Department. This is particularly for Asha and Sylvia, but there's a handful of startling analogies in Afghanistan to Vietnam 1973 with our negotiations with the Taliban kind of excluding the Afghan national government. And the Taliban operating in very similar ways to the Viet Cong. The primary difference is there being that through supporting al-Qaeda, the Taliban has a history of attacking the U.S. homeland or supporting attacks on the U.S. homeland, where the Viet Cong very specifically tried to avoid doing so. With domestic appetite for supporting these wars in the Middle East and South Asia dwindling over time, how do we avoid returning Afghanistan to 1996?
Great, and then woman right in front, please.
Mary Speck, I'm a senior associate with CSIS. I have a question for Emily about generational change within the Latino community, particularly in Florida. And I was wondering whether the crisis in Venezuela and the consensus that there is within Latin America for a peaceful transition in Venezuela has any reflection within the Latino community in terms of supporting a peaceful transition and more consensus around the issue of Cuba, particularly around the issue of human rights and the need for a change in Cuba, but a peaceful change in Cuba.
And we'll take a couple more if there are questions, and then additional questions right here, please. And then pretty soon we'll come back to the panel to wrap up.
Mithra Dinakar, a local high school student.
Great.
So we've touched on immigration and anti-Semitism. So specifically, how can we foster cultural acceptance and empathy from Americans to people of foreign nations and from those of foreign nations to Americans?
Super. Thank you. And is there a final question, or should that be it? One more right here, please. Here comes the mic.
Thank you. Eunice Reddick, former State Department. This is back to Janine, but perhaps other members of the panel regarding opportunities in Africa, or missed opportunities on the trade side. There's been a lot of praise for the new BUILD Act that will create the new international Development Finance Corporation and bring in collaboration, more coordination between U.S. government agencies, but also the opportunity to bring in equity financing that should help give us a seat at the table that's now occupied by China on infrastructure and even the EU. But we haven't seen the implementing legislation yet, so we don't know what this is going to look like. And perhaps we are putting, or those supporters, and this bipartisan support for the BUILD Act, but are we putting all of our eggs in one basket that may not necessarily give us the opportunity for U.S. business, but also to increase economic prosperity in Africa? So I'm thinking about what worked 30 years ago, for example, in U.S. Cooperation partnership with Southeast Asian countries, for example. What else are we missing in terms of tools for that partnership with African countries on economic growth?
Super, thank you. And so now we're going to go to the panel, starting with Janine and just working down. You've been all very kind to not only ask great questions, but to divvy them up geographically. So we've got a couple on Africa, one on Latin America, one on South Asia and Afghanistan. And because I never want to see my good buddy Jung Pak left out, I'm also going to add a question for her, which is one last element of these interlinkages that we haven't yet discussed too much today, which is Americans living abroad, and specifically Americans living in Korea, and how that may shape how we think about crises on the Korean Peninsula, because I've learned from Jung on this issue in the past. So without further ado, if we could just work down the panel, a couple of minutes each, and then we'll finish panel one and move to panel two. My friend.
Thank you. I think with regard to Chinese investment in Africa, yes, on the one hand, there is the element of resentment or people feeling that the Chinese don't come with an even-keeled approach. At the same time, I think many officials or private sector people, if you ask them, will say, but the U.S. is generally felt to be missing. And so I think there is a great deal of interest, a great deal of thirst, if you will, for Americans to come in and to invest in the continent. People feel as though the American companies that come in are much more balanced in their approach. They provide training. They work much more readily with local counterparts. And I think that we have to have ways and means to encourage American businesses to actually come in. And I think that goes to the second question that was directed towards me, which is, what are some of the tools, what are some of the things that we need to have at our disposal? We have not seen what the BUILD Act will actually look like, but I think that it is a step in the right direction because it will allow us to take equity. It will allow us to maybe look at some of the other areas where we have been missing, maybe in infrastructure and other, and to leverage some of those opportunities where we have not been as strong in terms of engaging U.S. private sector operators on the continent and kind of leveling that playing field where others tend to have a lot more state support or other types of advantages. So I think we're looking in the right direction. We have yet to see what it will really look like in terms of having new tools at our disposal to do that. But I do know that there is an amazing thirst for American companies of all sizes, not just the large corporations, but the SMEs who can really engage, particularly with younger people and with women entrepreneurs and others. And those are really some of the backbone companies that you have out there. There's a great deal of thirst for Americans to come out and to provide those linkages. And it leads to the prosperity, the stability, the peace dividends that I've spoken about earlier. So, yeah.
That's great. Thank you. Emily, over to you.
Thank you, Mary, for your question. I think you're right. In Venezuela, there has been a regional consensus, and not just a regional consensus, in many respects, a global consensus. And in some aspects, U.S. rhetoric, at least, has gotten out ahead of that consensus, arguing for, at times, apparently, a military intervention, whereas the region and the world has been much more reserved. In Florida specifically, and you asked about a generational divide, and I'll speak about Cuba. the Florida International University does a poll regularly to assess the views of Cuban Americans in Florida vis-a-vis U.S. policy toward Cuba, and it shows a very clear generational divide. That younger Cuban Americans in Florida believe that engagement is the best answer for U.S. policy toward Cuba, and the reasons why are multifaceted. It's because U.S. policy toward Cuba, as stated, the embargo has not worked, has not achieved its intended purposes, but also because they see engagement as in the best interest of U.S. national interest, but also the Cuban people. There's a burgeoning private sector in Cuba that flourished when engagement reached its peak at the end of the Obama administration. And in many respects, the private sector invested a tremendous amount of capital and took huge risks to set up small businesses in the hospitality sector and in second tier, second order private sector businesses that would benefit from an influx of cash for the hospitality sector. And a lot of them have lost a lot with the downturn of U.S. travel to the region. And there's a tremendous organization in Florida based out of Miami called Cuba One that takes second-generation Cuban Americans, younger folks, on trips to the island. Families with a lot of history, a lot of emotions, and tackles those and in some instances introduces young Cuban Americans to family members with whom they've been separated for decades. It's very powerful, but it's powerful not just at the personal level, but also in showing the next generation of Cuban Americans the impact that engagement can have at the personal and broader policy level.
Excellent. Thank you. Laura, over to you.
Okay. Well, I'd like to address the Africa question as well, particularly as it relates to Europe. So Europe colonized Africa, and as the child of former Belgian colonial subjects, and as Mike knows, Belgian colonial rule was amongst the most brutal. I think for the United States, there's an opportunity to come in as an alternative to China and Europe. And Europe is also invested in Africa, addressing the things that Janine mentioned, like the youth bulge, because of the migration crisis is also not just coming from the Middle East, but also coming from Africa. So Germany, for example, is proposing a Marshall Plan in Africa. So knowing that, and also France with Emmanuel Macron, he's made multiple trips to Africa, again, to address the migration issue and encouraging folks to stay there. And hopefully, by staying there, he mentioned that it's important for them to stay there because there are these business opportunities, especially if folks really harness them. And so with that, I feel like the United States could be a credible partner. And then I think it's also important who the United States can send. So like it was mentioned that we don't want to highlight that we are a neo-colonial power. I think that's a great opportunity where diaspora communities could play an important role, me being part of one. And then I think another thing that diaspora communities, especially the more recent African immigrant communities in America, can provide is again, trying to harness the power of remittances. So in many cases, remittances are keeping a lot of African countries alive, including my parents' native, the Democratic Republic of Congo. So if there's a way to better harness remittances, I think that's also a big opportunity there. And then I wanted to talk about the question about empathy. So a big thing that I'm realizing having, again, I call myself Afro-European American. Being a total third culture kid, I think a big thing is highlighting interconnectedness. I'm American. My parents are from the Congo. I have cousins in Canada, the UK, South Africa. Probably someone's in China at this point. But I think it's highlighting the interconnectedness. And it's not just and I would also say it's not always the onus on the people of color to the teaching, but also the other communities to be receptive. And I think also just finish up the question about the red flags. I think a big thing is having folks from those communities in positions of power, because they usually notice those red flags head on. And I think with the new Congress, with new members like Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar and John Neguse, who are from diaspora communities that have experienced war or turmoil, that they could be the ones to start pushing that conversation.
Fantastic. Wove a lot into that. Very good and cogent and succinct answer. Asha, over to you.
Yes, with regards to Afghanistan, the way I approach in terms of achieving stability, There's two ways I see that should be a priority, and one of them is we're definitely working on is to continuously invest in the women in terms of SSR, security sector reform, getting them involved more in the security sector. I think that is invaluable moving forward in achieving stability and empowering them too as elected officials. That would be a definitely key move forward for the future of Afghanistan. The other piece to it I see is that we need a comprehensive regional approach or strategy for Afghanistan. General Mattis had mentioned this during the beginning of his term that this was necessary, but unfortunately not all the key players were involved in that regional strategy. You definitely do need Pakistan, Iran, India, China, and possibly Russia to be part of that and to build a consensus on how we can achieve stability in Afghanistan. If you do not include those key players, you're going to pretty much have a setback in terms of achieving stability there. And going back to a point with human rights, I think the one thing that's very important is to groom leaders of tomorrow to get involved in these human rights issues and be able to articulate how whatever's going on overseas in terms of, human rights violation, how that connects at home. And there's a lot of examples of that, especially for those that have experienced, human rights issues. So I think we need to have leaders that know how to articulate it well as far as connecting what goes on home versus globally. And I think once we have that, we'll be better off. Mm-hmm.
Super. Thank you. John.
Hi. Mike, I think your question about Americans living abroad and the empathy question can be put together. Senator Graham, at the height of this fire and fury and locked and loaded when North Korea said, in talking about preemptive strikes against North Korea, that it's better if people die over there than if people die over here. So before war gets over to our shores. And I thought it was a really tone-deaf way of putting things, just to put it mildly. But it neglected the fact that millions of people, Americans, who are constantly traveling through Asia, through Africa, through Latin America, and we're constantly on the move. And I think that part of the empathy issue is that that travel abroad is a key part of developing empathy and inspiring the next generation of national security professionals. Our friend and colleague Amanda Sloat here, who was a State Department, who was a diplomat, said she wasn't really interested in being a diplomat or Europe until she traveled overseas and studied in Europe. And now she's the leading voice on Europe, in addition to representing U.S. interests with Europe. So I think, studying abroad and feeling safe abroad is highly dependent on how protected you feel by the U.S. government. And one of the greatest things I think about the U.S. passport is that you can take it and that you're an American citizen and that there'll be somebody backstopping you, the consulate, the embassy at these various locations. And I think when we look at Otto Warmbier, who was detained by North Korea and came back in a coma, Jamal Khashoggi, U.S. resident, and there was not very much of a, opposition criticism of what happened to them. Right. It sends a really stark message to people to Americans who are going to travel overseas and to those regimes that are not amenable or who don't want Americans speaking abroad or criticizing their government, et cetera. And so I think, empathy, travel abroad, and U.S. government protection are all really intertwined.
Fantastic. Thank you. And Sylvia, to you for the last word.
Thank you for a great question on Afghanistan. It is a very difficult question as we try to grapple with the way ahead in Afghanistan. I do agree with Asha, what you said about the importance of having a comprehensive regional strategy and approach towards Afghanistan. However, one of the key ingredients right now, I think, is having transparency in talks. What we do not know are what are the red lines that in the negotiations that the United States is having with the Taliban. and in that case, transparency with the NATO allies would be essential. I would ideally like a return back to the Afghan-led, Afghan-owned process. We have to understand, it was just yesterday, the New York Times reported that Taliban, which now controls majority of Afghanistan, there was an attack on Afghan national security forces, and 30 police personnel were killed. Now, what we know till 2019 April is that the United States and Taliban have come to an understanding that the Taliban would not host terror networks in Afghanistan territory. Are we really supposed to take those words on face value? So essentially looking at transparency measures. And I would also like to tease out a bit from Asha's point and talk more about regional partnership. In 2017 South Asia strategy, there was important emphasis and mention of what India can do in Afghanistan, and the Trump administration welcomed a greater role of India in the region. India is the 5th largest donor in Afghanistan in dollar terms, and it has also built a lot of goodwill in terms of its development assistance to the region. Therefore, thinking about ways and coordinating how we could probably accommodate the Taliban, but also within the broader framework of a Afghan-led, Afghan-owned process, because we really do not want to relinquish of all the grounds that we have achieved in the last 18 years in terms of advancing on human rights issues and just creating.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.